All right, so the first thing that I would like to say is thank you guys very much for coming. I really appreciate you guys coming, and I am one of the few small guys who does this or does training that can get government contracts and works with a variety of different things, and I am just honored that everybody appreciates what I do enough that I'm able to make a good living at doing this, and I mean it's an exciting life, as you can see. And I really appreciate you guys for taking the time and coming and honoring me enough to find me and do it. So thank you guys. So I try to do everything I can, as you've seen, to put my blood, sweat, and tears into this class. And if there's any suggestions or anything, please email them to me when you're writing the evaluation. I do take the suggestions and try to figure stuff out, like I added the iPad in for people who said I couldn't see it on the whiteboard or something like that. So I'll take those suggestions. One of the hardest ones is that a lot of people will say there's too much material in the class and that this should be like a 2-week class.
Well, it'd be nice if you spread it out for
Right.
2 weeks.
This is one of the reasons why I call it a boot camp course, and I tell everybody it's grueling before they come. I tell them it is grueling. And the reason is because we're doing 6 days worth of work in 5 days. And so literally we're doing 50-something hours of training, 20-something hours of that is rebuilding hard drives and going through that process. And then we do other labs and other things. So really about half the class, even though it doesn't seem like it because people are tired of Scott talking, that half the class is all labs and hands-on and walking through stuff. And if the opinion is that there's something that, because a lot of people will say, if we made this 2 weeks, then you could, take more time and spend more time on each individual item, and we could go slower and comprehend the material, take more breaks, because I don't take a lot of breaks, as you've seen. Probably very few instructors do that, because they like to take a coffee break too. But I feel like I'm working just as hard as you're working. So I want to work for your money and make sure that everybody gets the value that they're supposed to have. So the problem is this. If you thought there was something wrong, there was too much material, there was something else that you would change, tell me what to remove. Tell me what you didn't need that I did all week long that I should remove. Or if I should add something, then something else has to go. There's just no two things about it. If there's something that's more important than soldering, what would it be? Well, right.
One thing, can you pre-buy those deep spots? It would be nice if you had the option when you come here, if you have the equipment, you can learn on your own and take it with you.
Yes, but then what happens is, so I have on my website the option. You can go to the option page, you can check whatever you want for equipment. My problem is this. If the base class is $3,500, and then I give the 30-day discount $300 off if somebody comes in. So everybody pays $3,200. Try to tell your boss, I need $8,000 to go to this class. And this is my problem, is that a lot of people have a budget, they have a number they can do. It's usually $3,000. Military, government have like a $3,000 number. If they're at $29,995, they can spend the money and not get approval. If they go over $3,000, they have to have this 60-day approval process, then they can't get in the class. So there is some magic things that happen here. If you say, I want to buy hardware, here, give me the kits, then yes, it's $1,200 for all the other stuff that's not take home in the class, and then there's $3,000 or so. Not to mention though, this week is the first time it's ever happened. DeepSpar had that sale, and the price that you got for the DeepSpar, if you'd already bought it, and it was, you paid $3,200, which is normally what I get it for. Plus, then you have to buy the network kit, would have been another $350. This is the cheapest that I've ever seen. This sale that DeepSpar is doing. At $2,600 plus you got a 10% discount because you took my class,
He said
or whatever it was.
No, it wasn't. He just said $2,500 flat.
Right, $2,500 flat. So did you hear that, Chase? DeepSpar sold them DeepSpars with the network module for $2,500 this week.
And free shipping.
Yeah, free shipping, everything. It's the best price I've ever seen. I've never seen a price below $3,000. Period. I've never seen one. So I'm just saying.
Yeah, I didn't think of it that way. So
Right.
It'd be nice because you have your own equipment, you leave here, hey, guess what?
Right.
You got a book. You don't
Well, and I could do that, but yes, if we add everything on, then some people might want the Atoll. They might be like, why'd you sell me a DeepSpar? You really like an Atoll? So I'm not really in the business of selling the stuff. That's not really my job. I do resell stuff, and I can resell all of it. However, I tell the reseller, I'm not here just to sell your product. I'm not only selling your thing. I'm not trying to sell one thing. I'm trying to teach these people. They pay me. And I don't want to be bought by anybody. I am my own man. And so I am not going to sign NDAs. I'm not going to make contracts and deals. If they don't like it, too bad. Screw them. I don't need them. So, and I don't want it to be that way. I've dealt with vendors like that 20 years ago when I started doing networking. And when you get into a contract, they'll be like, well, you can't sell that product because you sell our product. And so you can't sell an Indian motorcycle because you sell a Harley Davidson. Like, that doesn't sound right to me. I don't want that kind of environment. So that's why I don't, but it is an option on my page. So you can buy platter tools and things like that, because I do get things sometimes people can't get. Especially government agencies. Government agencies, a lot of times, cannot buy equipment from outside the country. So I am licensed to sell most of the equipment inside the country through to government agencies. So a lot of times they'll call me after they take a class or something. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that's the only thing. But that's just about money and most of the time approval. If I told you needed $8,000 to come to class, most people would, there's a spot where you just stop. There's too many options. There's too much. So learn the equipment and you decide what you need. What can you make? Some of you are going to buy a platter tool. Some of you are going to use tape. That's just the way it is. Some of it can be done other ways. So that's my opinion from that standpoint. But I really appreciate you guys coming. And please, if you'll put some constructive criticism, if you have the time to type it, I appreciate it. If there's anything you think should change. And I gradually do change or do new versions or do something else. And I'll try to help you guys also later. If something comes up and you want to send me an email, I can't always respond right away. Like, I did not answer hardly any emails this week. But if you do, the other thing is I've established to try to help people is, just like you guys are all going to email each other, there's another 2,000, 3,000 people like you who took this class, who if they'd have been in this class, you'd have had just the right, you'd have had the same relationship with them. You guys would be buddy-buddy, you would help each other, and they're in the data in the Google group. In the Google group that I had listed on the first pages of the book, go join that and see the discussions going on. Join in the discussions, help each other, because no one else is doing it like we are. So you can find other people who will help you, and there's brilliant people in those areas as well. So there's plenty of people who will help you, and they both do forensics and they both do data recovery. So just remember that from that standpoint. And so I'm not your sole resource, but there are a lot of brilliant people out there who have been doing it, and some have completely different experiences, and they write stuff, they help me out, they come, like if I go to DC and if you're in DC and you want to come drop in on the class or help out, let me know. A lot of times other people will come in and help out on classes when I travel. So I got 2 people in DC who come and help all the time just for fun. So they stay hot on it, they get all the new topics, they can listen in class and hear all the new stuff. So those kind of things, okay? So again, I appreciate it, thank you very much. All right, the last segment, solid state drives. So now we have talked about solid state drives pretty thoroughly throughout this class, and a few of you, like Josh, had quite a few things to offer from that standpoint. All of you had something to say about it or your experiences with it. So Greg's got some that he's done for data recovery or working with thumb drives. All of you have shared your experiences, so you guys have all kind of learned from each other, and that's the way it is. Solid state's all new, even though it seems, some stuff's been around for a long time. It's been around since '84. Somebody is applying software to a physical piece of hardware, a chip, and doing weird stuff with it. And it's changing from one person to the next all the time. So there's a couple of things we did point out that I just want to mention before, and I'm going to get a little more exciting here. I'm going to show you guys an animation, and the last part of the presentation will be animated. So at least it's cartoony, and it's a little more entertaining than dealing with just text on the screen and death by PowerPoint, which has been most of the week, right? So we talked about trim. The whole point of trim is that you can tell if it's a hard drive or a solid state drive. And solid state will turn off functions so that it doesn't destroy the disk while you're using it. That's entirely the point of trim. Trim also has the instant delete, but again, its whole point was to be fast and to survive. So it instantly deletes content, supposed to. It doesn't always. Sometimes it puts it in a garbage collection routine and does it later, or fakes you out. But the whole point is that if we leave the memory stick as free as possible, or the chip as free as possible, it will write faster. So you've got to delete content, because if you fill up the disk and it's all in one cycle, like you do a wipe drive, like I wipe the drive, it never gets a break, so it's writing all the time. So it would never clean up the sectors that you erased. So things like that. So understand, trim is there to do some different things. Thumb drives also, they have capacitors and resistors on them that sometimes act like protection. They act like TVSs. So this is basically the same thing as that transient voltage suppressor, the fuse. And we've done this many times. There's actually 5 on a SanDisk that when a SanDisk kind of blows or it won't do anything, it shorts. And if you take these 5 off, it actually works. So believe it or not, without those being there at all, it is possible to do this. I've done it many times where I've actually removed the different sets of items there. Now there's a way better picture. One of the guys who discovered this his name is Tim Farron, not Tim Farrow. There's a Tim Farron, and he's in the Google group as well. He's got some high density pictures of this where you can actually see what chips and where he's talking about. But other people have discovered things like this as well. Now, when we're talking about chip readers, because this is what everybody's always bringing up, and we addressed it on the first day, I'm just going to show you Flash Doctors and what it looks like and why. And certainly this isn't the best one by far, but I'm just trying to show an example. PC3000 has pretty much taken most of the lead, and Resolute. Those two have taken the lead as far as doing flash drives. Again, costs a lot of money to stay up on these things. So Salvation Data has this. I owned it, I bought it. It's one of my many $5,000 items that I bought at the time. They claim to be able to do a bunch of things they can't do. They have a little socket here where you take your chips off. You can, whatever chip you're trying to read, they have a different size for it. So you can pop off the adapter, put another adapter on, pop the chip in, and then read it. Reading chips most of the time is not the problem. The only time that it's really a problem is if the chip goes bad and you can't read it. That's when that's a problem. Now you can't do anything. And if it's one in a set, then the whole set is screwed. You can't do anything with it at all. But reading chips most of the time is not the problem. You can put them in, you can read them. The problem is, what do you do with it afterwards? Is it encrypted? What's the layout? How many of them have to be combined? You think RAID is complicated? This is just what you're doing from a timing standpoint so you can get in and read it. After you actually finally configure that out and you can read the chip, then you get to this screen. And this screen is like, let's select all the layouts. Now remember earlier when Greg said, hey, if you're on a PC3000 flash, everybody shared their solutions. PC3000 was paying people $5 a solution for a while. I don't know if they pay anybody anything anymore. For a while, if you figured it out and you sent in a solution for a chip that they verified worked, they put it in their database, they'd give you $5. I don't know how that's anything, because it's like 3 days of work before you get that far. Big deal. So, but people did share them. They just shared them because they wanted everybody to be able to have a solution. We want a working product that works for everything. So if the chip is recognized, it'll download it from the database and you'll be able to talk to the chip. And you don't have to worry about all the items in the layout. But you do still have to worry about how many chips there are, how many you're going to weave together, and it looks a little bit like a RAID array when you're reassembling it in PC3000 Flash. But at least from that standpoint, you have a lot of options and a lot of things you have to play with. Some things used to be in clear text. They're not in clear text anymore. So now it's compression and encryption. And those are the big problems, is trying to get past it. So, but without a solution from a SanDisk chip, you can't read it and do anything with it. But you would desolder the chip, just like we did the chip that we did yesterday. Then you would take that, put it in the reader, read the content from it, and then you could actually then go forward and do something with it. One of the other problems with solid state is that as the device sits there, powered up, it will start to clear itself. It'll start doing garbage collection. It'll start erasing sectors for things that should not, under normal circumstances, be erased. So in other words, here are MFT entries. What does the red X mean?
Deleted.
It's deleted, right? But that usually means, even if it's deleted, maybe something else overwrote the data, but data would be there. There would be some data. It wouldn't be blank. So every file that I go through that the MFT thinks is deleted is actually 0 in this particular example. This is a real recovery that I was doing. This is a real forensics case, actually. But in this particular instance, the whole point being is that all of these items were 0 and zeroed out. So this was kind of the start that I started dealing with what happens during garbage collection, what happens with solid state. So I'm going to switch. In the book, I have pictures and I have stuff, and I've tracked this all the way through, but I have an animation that I did. So I want to give you the animation and show you this in a little bit snappier view. Do you need anything? You okay? Okay.
Mesmerized.
Okay.
Everything else is loud.
Well, we'll be okay. Do what you need to do to get it closed up or whatever. And then you don't have to stay when you're done. These guys will help me throw boxes in the car or something, so it'll be fine.
You
Okay?
want me to put any in my car?
No, I don't think so. I think we're all right. Okay. So you can take that bag of dead drives back there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry for the interruption. All right. So solid state versus hard drives. All the stuff you've learned all week with regards to hard drives and how it relates to solid state drives and how solid state drives basically work is the premise that I'm going through here with NAND and a number of things. So let me. I have this kind of. This is my big disclaimer. Hard drive manufacturers, how many are there? Three left. There were hundreds back in the day. Back in the day, there were hundreds, if not 1,000. And they all bought each other. They all merged. Everybody, sooner or later, some went bankrupt, some disappeared. But gradually throughout the year, all the technology has merged together to the point that even though I gave you different hard drives, did they all look basically the same? I mean, they all look basically the same. Some point an actuator arm this way, some point an actuator arm this way. Some park on the outside of a platter, some park on the inside of a platter. That's about it. That's about as much variation as you have. Everything else looked the same, right? So just a couple of things are changed, and there's not much to them. Solid state, on the other hand, this is the beginning. We're at the beginning of the cusp of where they're actually designing them. So everybody's stuff is intellectual property. Everybody's protecting it, and most of it's software. Most of it's not hardware. Very little of it is hardware. The hardware and the layout for a solid state is almost identical from one manufacturer to the other. It's all the stuff that happens behind that controls it that's different. So understand this big disclaimer is that we're only at the beginning. Everybody's going to change, and I guarantee you 2 to 3 years from now, it will look completely. I've been doing this for 10 years. 10 years ago, solid state looked completely different than it did today. As a matter of fact, a lot of solid state 10 years ago didn't even have actual RAM on it. They couldn't cache anything. They were actually just NAND drives themselves, and there was nothing else. They weren't much more complicated than a thumb drive. But after 2009, everybody put a encryption chip on. And after 2009, from 2010 on, it was all different. Every one of them was different. So they do change over time, and they change rapidly. So just understand, we're at the beginning. Things might not survive the way you think they are. A solid state disk basically says, I have no moving parts. That's fundamentally what it means. It is a set of chips, and they are solid state. There is nothing that's moving, so everything that's running through it is just basically captured in memory or captured in something. This is one of my jokes, so you just kind of have to live through my joke. It's a real thing. Like we get drives in all the time. My girlfriend found out that I was chatting with some other girl, so she took my hard drive, she threw it out the window. She took my laptop, threw it down an escalator. Things like that happen. So this was a real hard drive, and it hits the ground. Even though there's things that try to save the hard drive so that when it hits the ground, it'll survive, it's all BS. If it gets hit by a car, it's going to be destroyed, I promise. If it falls out of a window, if it goes more than 2 feet off even a foot, done. The head just ate into the disk. Something horrible happened. So it completely destroys the head, eats the platter, does whatever. But what if this laptop had been an SSD? So this is my Wayback Machine. This is my time machine. Like, now it goes, now it's a solid state drive. So now if it was a solid state drive, as long as it didn't hit on that corner, destroy it, get smashed by a car, hit that, a board cracks, something like that, it'll be running. This is my this is my version of Hitachi's disco ball. This is a party on a chip. That's what that is. So this is the disco ball going on and everything. Do break it down. Hey, Mr. Actuator Man. There's no Actuator Man here. So anyway, so this is okay. You used to have little smiley faces running across too. There'd be little smiley faces that would run across the So it survives. It's fine. He can take it out of his laptop. He can put it in, and then he's happy with whatever he has, whatever his data is. Okay, it's not like 90% of you didn't know that it was porn. Or nude pictures of his girlfriend, things like that we get to see on a day. Chase's brain has slowly melted over the few years. I think he's to the point where he can't tell his girlfriend what he does for a living. So anyway, so gradually, at least over time, this will be the kind of things you're looking at. Now, other reasons you might want to get a solid state drive if you didn't have one, which everybody knows that you're basically trying to keep your heads from moving, because every time you move your iPad, your Mac, or something else, it can whack the disk or something. So supposedly reading and writing reliability is better. And that's mostly still just in theory, because it still uses ECC. It still uses the same basic principles that you're used to with hard drives. They're not really zeros and ones. It is, when it gets to the cell level, a gate. So the gate is being registered as that. But whereas on a hard drive, the content's basically more like a waveform. It is actually reading an analog signal and trying to determine if the analog signal is a high or a low, and that's how it's counting it as a bit. So there's actually a process that's involved there. So this may be a little more stable from that standpoint, but that's not really one of the reasons. One of the main reasons also, and here's the other thing, 10 years ago, the speed on a solid state disk, they were slower than hard drives. Now they're faster than hard drives, and most of that was achieved by jamming power into it and adding RAM and adding compression and other things that actually improve performance. So they're tricking it out a lot to make that happen. But those come at a price. Anytime something bad happens, anything that occurs will cause physical damage to it, so it actually can slowly deteriorate by comparison. So at least at this point, you're supposed to have location independent speed, and they are faster, but most of it is tricks. So power consumption, there's pretty much no doubt most of the time that a piece of plastic and what's going on here is going to be less than a motor spinning. But there are some examples of where solid state drives have used more power than even a laptop hard drive, because the power consumption is based on speed. The faster it is, the more power it's going to need. So basically that will actually consume more power. Then you also have noise and vibration. This is the best part of it, that it's silent, that you're not hearing anything spinning, doesn't make any noise. They can still get hot, but they're not as hot as a spinning disc. Some of the stuff in the spinning disc can cook an egg, literally cook an egg. So when they're trapped in a laptop or something like that. So this was basically the first MacBook Pro. The first MacBook Pro was on fire. It would cook your gonads. So literally you would have nothing compared to solid state when you finally get to a spot where it's actually, not that it's icy cool, but it's certainly cooler, right? Everybody good with this? So there is a huge difference with that, and there's a huge difference in weight and what it takes to manufacture one. So there's a lot that goes into a hard drive, and some of it's precious metals by comparison to what goes into a solid state drive. So those are the fluffy things. Let's talk about the real stuff now. These are basically your three types of solid state. This is basically all that exists in the world as far as types of solid state. And so the first one was DRAM. It was a DRAM server. It was based on the fact that I'm going to use RAM, computer RAM, which is volatile, that will blink itself when you turn off the power or something. You lose all your transactions. But I'm going to make that into a server. And its advantage is it's really fast. It is one of the fastest, and most of the time it's financial organizations that have these servers. They have piles of them in the back doing hundreds of thousands of transactions. They will last a lot longer. Their memory is far more robust, and you'll get decades out of them in some cases. So military's using them. If I was going to drive a tank across the desert or something and I needed a server running in there, I would choose something like this. It would be fast. I could do calculations. I can store data fast. But as soon as the power's out, whoo, that's a big problem. It's gone. So what they have is something similar to hibernation. So the hibernate mode in your laptop, when you close it, they have something very similar that when power goes out, they can spin down, store it on a disk, and most of these would have, high-end power supplies connected to them that would maintain battery life and other stuff if the power went out. But as a whole, they do have a way that you can actually stop them during transactions and then bring them back from the dead by restoring them. So, but these are not very portable. This is not what we're going to deal with. One of these two is one of the kinds we are normally going to deal with, NOR and NAND. And they're both mathematical algorithms. They're basically a principle about a grid and how the data is divided up, similar to XOR. What?
That's a not or.
Right, a not or and not NAND mathematical operation. So both of them were created by this guy, Fujio Masusuka. Fujio Masusuka. I've been saying it wrong for 10 years. So this guy, he worked for Toshiba, And he is the first guy to create these two. So he worked in a lab in the 80s, in the early 80s, and he created both types of these around 1984. Now, he didn't even know what they were going to use them for, and actually Toshiba turned around and sold his intellectual property to Intel in 1986 and made bukus of money and did not give him credit. And apparently there had been a fight for like 20 years for him trying to get credit and getting royalties for getting paid. He filed a lawsuit in the early 2000s because of thumb drives and all the stuff that was out there that gradually he was getting no money for. And he did win. He won his battle and against Toshiba, and I think he got paid $750,000. That's what he made. Yep. $750,000. And everything we use today, I mean, can you imagine everywhere you go that there's a sign, here it is, here's NAND, here's flash, here's all your stuff, and I created it, and it's everywhere. It's on every single device, and how you would feel that you got ripped off in this whole process. And he does run another company now. I don't remember all the details at this point, but as a whole, he created both of these. Now, NOR is, we do not normally carry around anything that has NOR from a standpoint in our pockets. This is the kind of stuff that you would use in a BIOS, or, you know, remember when motherboards came out and they said, we now can flash our BIOS. And so they had flashable BIOSes, and you could upgrade your BIOS instead of having to remove a chip or put something else in it. And so you put a floppy disk in, you'd boot it, you'd run off of this tool, it would erase, and so it would go really fast. Huh? Yeah, like an EEPROM. It's like an EEPROM, but not quite a double EEPROM. Double EEPROMs are a little bit different with, so NOR did not have to be erased by being put under ultraviolet lights. So a double EEPROM is a step back from NOR from a standpoint. This is the first one completely done through software. It's very similar to NAND, but it operates differently in the fact of its destruction. You can only write to it 10 times. Basically, after 10 times, you slowly destroy it. So it's really good for embedded devices that don't update often, that you make a new patch, you erase it, and the erasure cycle, so the erasure cycle is really, really slow. The write cycle is really, is still fairly slow, but the read cycles are really, really fast. So you can get a really fast read from it, but a really slow write to it. So that's why when you would flash your BIOS, it would go erase, and then say don't boot, and then sit there, and it just go chunk, 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 and it would write that to your BIOS, and you'd have a new refresh. So, but these are not very efficient at what we're using flash drives for, what we're doing with flash drives. So that would be NAND. So NAND is another type of chip he was creating. It does save its state. It has gates. So it has the ability to store data without being powered on because it's captured, basically. It's captured in silicone. So however you want to look at it from that standpoint, we're capturing its state in a gate, and we're going to keep it there, and we're going to measure its resistance so that we actually have a charge, and we either have a charge or we don't have a charge. So we're going to talk about this one and how it works fundamentally. So as a gate, now this is really a gate. I'm calling it a cell, but in the book I have a picture of a gate. But fundamentally a gate, and I've destroyed what it looks like. It's nothing like this. I made a paint can. My idea was, how do I take a gate, and I try to explain it to somebody very simplistically. So I made a paint can, and the paint can get rusty over time and gradually start to deteriorate. It has a saran wrap at the top, which is the oxide layer. We're basically going to do something called hot electron injection. Hot electron injection is a process of charging it and capturing electrons inside of the silicone as it's moving around. So basically at this point, what's going to happen is we're going to go from an empty state of 1. It's also the opposite of what you believe it should be. If it is charged and there is content in it, it is a 0. When it is empty, it is a 1. So the cell, this is physically the hardware. This is physically how the hardware itself works. So as you're going through the process, you're injecting electrons through hot electron injection. Now, it's not one electron that it's basically capturing as it's moving around. You're getting a whole slew of them that is then causing a measurement to happen, and you have a transistor that is basically doing that measurement, which is almost identical to what happens in the floating gate itself. So you capture the state, and it flips from a 1 to a 0. So now as you're going through this process, you also have something called write endurance. Every time you write and erase, it does a little bit of destruction. It will gradually kill the cell. until it can no longer store any data in it anymore at all. Now, it used to be in what's called SLC, 100,000 writes. We have gradually diminished that, so as we've gotten bigger space, we've had to go to MLC, triple bit, quad bits, and as we've done that, we've diminished how many times you can write to it. And I'll explain this in a second here with a chart that shows you. But basically, this is something that I found on a developer site who is making NANDs. There's only a handful of companies making NAND and selling them. So, so this one, when flash memory wafers are tested and probed, the distribution of bad and weak and strong dies are identified across the wafer. Bad cells are marked, and the remaining are sorted into consumer and industrial quality flash. Consumer grade flash makes it into flash disks that are mass marketed through retail outlets. The whole point being this: they sell you trash.
Cheap stuff.
Yeah, the stuff that failed. The good stuff goes to Cisco or goes in a server or goes someplace else. The bad stuff is what you went to the store and you bought hanging off the shelf. And so, and that's not unlike anything else that happens. Intel does the same thing. Everybody does the same thing. Let's divide the good stuff up and send the good stuff to people who are willing to pay good money, and their name is their reputation. So in other words, you don't want your Cisco router to die from bad memory because of something that's just, shitty memory. So it's a lot. If you as an individual bought a flash drive, you're only going to piss off one person. If you are pissing off everybody who has a Cisco router, you'd piss off the company, all those people, corporations.
And the consumers.
Yeah, right.
They depend on,
Right. But otherwise, they just pissed you off with a flash drive, which is okay, because you're one person. Only you are going to die. No one else is going to die. So as we move into the other stuff, so when we're moving now, again, I'm destroying the rendition of what something really is. MLC does not have two layers like this. It does not exist in reality, as that it ends up being one gate that is just charged with more content. So in other words, think about this. If you overclock your processor, you're jamming more power through it. You're doing more disservice to that processor. It's going to destroy it. That's what happens when you take an SLC and you make it an MLC. When it's an MLC, now this is not your option. The manufacturer decides to make them that way. So what happens is they can store twice the number of bits as you could store as SLC. SLC was simple, 0 or 1. Those were your bits. So now if you come up with an algorithm that allows you to store more so that you could try to get more of a count, this is not an XOR table. I guess it is kind of an XOR table once it's stored in there. But, right. But ultimately, the whole point ends up being is that once you've charged content, now here's how I can describe it that makes the most sense. If you have a house and you live on a street, you have a block. If you live in this house with your wife, then the two of you are going to have a very nice, pristine house. Nobody's doing damage to it, nothing along the way. You each have one room for each kid. So you decide to have 2 kids, and you have one room for each kid. So now one group of people is living in the house. Still minimal damage. You can see each person in the house. It's all going to be great. But now your cousin loses his job. And your cousin and his wife move into your house with their kids. So now the 2 kids are going to have kids in each room, and for some reason your cousin and his wife are going to sleep in your room with you. So however that happens. I'm just saying. So, nonetheless, the whole point being this. There's twice as many people. There's twice as many. Maybe it doesn't need to be your cousin. Maybe it's your best friend. Your best friend and his wife. Anyway, so the whole point being this. So, twice as many people are in the same amount of space, right? You're going to have way more destruction. The kids are going to be running around, putting holes in the walls. They're going to start tearing it up. So, and it's not just going to just be twice. It's going to be like 3-4 times as much destruction. And that's what happens when you go to MLC. You go from 100,000 writes to 10,000 writes. So you have a 10-fold destructive process that's happening. And 10,000 is pretty much an average, a maximum. So when you go to doing triple bit or quad, it actually drops even more. It drops down to between 3,000 and 5,000 writes. And that's per cell. So the only way that you can make that last longer is to fake people out. It's a trick. That cell never is going to live longer. If you write 3,000 times to that cell, it's going to die. It's just going to die. So the only way that you can do something is something called wear leveling. Wear leveling says instead of doing anything like this, I'm going to spread those rights all over the place. So I actually have 3 houses we live in, and me and my cousin and my kids and everybody go live in another house at some other time. We still have a bite, but because we're living on a grid, things are divided up differently. They're actually divided up into what's called the word line. So you have 16 bits on a grid in a word line. And that word line is how data is charged, because it's sitting in something that is actually physical, and it's a grid. And this grid, I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to fly through some slides because these slides back up all the text I was just saying. But when you get to this is what a gate actually looks like. So you actually have a real floating gate. You have a drain, so when you want to let everything out, you open up the gate, you let everything out. So then you actually will start again at state 1, which is 0, which nothing's in there. You also have this problem called cell-to-cell interference, which we also know as the superparamagnetic effect on hard drives. Bits will flip periodically. So that's one of the things that happens. Then you get here. So this is NAND. NAND, this is an SLC. And basically you had these 2 bits. The data is stored here in a charge. So you have basically a most significant, least significant, or you have a block line and a block erase. So you actually are living on a grid. And then as you increase and you go to MLC, you're now you have a least significant bit, a most significant bit, and your block lines. So again, in the same thing, you actually will increase it as you keep going through the process and creating more and more algorithms. It will then decrease more and more the quantity that you can actually read and write. So let me show you.
Like a red. You kill any one of those.
Yep. Kill any one of it, and it takes the entire cell. Not sometimes the entire cell, sometimes the block. Because not only is that grid done, it's done on a size. So it's 64 times the size that you're going to store the data. So when one goes, it takes the whole thing. In a lot of cases.
One word line in that stack will take out the whole stack?
Yes, it'll take out the entire chip itself, the entire cell. This is where things have become really bad in the last few years. Manufacturers will do things that are to your detriment to try to make it better for them. So they've started trying to have software guys try to figure out, well, if these are bad, let's not lose the whole cell or the whole sector or the whole block. Let's try to start figuring out algorithms that will allow us to just mark those as bad, and then we're still going to use other stuff in the rest of the grid that's okay. And we're going to read and write to that grid, and every time we write to that one spot, it's bad, and it actually will slowly start to deteriorate hardware. Hardware will start to deteriorate. So this is where smoke and mirrors have started to kick in from that standpoint, that they're trying to do tricks in software on hardware that is bad and trying to make it live longer. And you can see this is why SSDs are dying faster, and a bug kicks in or something causes a problem, and they're trying to run some algorithm to reuse the rest of the space. It's a terrible idea. So you end up in a situation where the whole thing goes. So we did have 512 byte sectors until right around 256 megs. Once we passed 256 megs, we no longer used 512 in solid state. They went immediately to a 2K sector, then a 4K sector, and the problem with that is that that segment is also done in blocks. So you don't just get one, 512, 2K sector, 4K sector. You get, like a hard drive has, an individual one, like physically on a platter. You make a whole bunch of them in a block, and then you sell the block. And it's usually a multiplier of about 64. There are some that are bigger, there are some that are smaller. You can choose 8, 16, typically they're going to be in segments like that. But you're saying, I'd like this one chip to be 64 times whatever the quantity of the sector is that I'm using. So that means I have 128K in one block. And if one block goes, you lose 128K. Does that make sense? This is why when they go bad, they go bad. Now this is the first time in all of this that I'm deviating from hardware. I'm going to talk about software as a whole. So in the erase cycle, this is not what happens. This is my artistic rendition. You do not see plastic tops popping off in the middle of your stuff and stuff escaping or anything like that. But this is to make a point. So Dr. Fujio Masusuka is working in the lab at Toshiba. And so as the story goes like this, he was working under a microscope And during the erase cycle, whenever he would release the electrons from the chip, you would actually see a little bright flash. So underneath the microscope in the room, apparently, it was actually visible. So there's another doctor who's working with him, and apparently he's the guy who coined the phrase of flash, because apparently, and his name is something like Dr. Suzuki or something like that. So he rides a fast motorcycle. Anyway, so
Ninja Suzuki.
he turns to the other guy, and he goes, "Oh, that looks like a Kodak camera flash," or whatever he said. And he said, "Kodak camera." And so, no, I know I'm completely destroying this, but whatever the story was, it's like watching one of them badly dubbed movies. You know that's not what they said. Whatever they said was not what happened. So the story that I have read has been, he said that looked like a Kodak camera flash. And the flash caused the bright light to happen. And then from there, you could actually see electrons escaping. And he called it flash. And that's how the name came to be flash. And we've called it that ever since. It's because of the way the erase cycle works. I don't know if flash is a real word in Japan. I have no idea if that's the word that they use. I have no idea. I imagine Kodak is probably, huh?
Polaroid.
Polaroid, yes. So anyway, so either way, that's what happened. The erase cycle goes on. And so now, when we're going through this process of erasing and then moving content, the whole point is I'm going to do something called the wear leveling. And that means that I have a sector, and I've written to that sector, say, 75 times. Well, during the process of doing this, I want to make sure that all of the other sectors have been written about the same amount of time. So the whole device ages together, rather than me only focusing on one spot. So in other words, if I took a phone and I put FAT on the phone, like the early Microsoft phones might have had, when I'm writing data to it, and it updates the same file over and over and over again, if it updates it in the same location in the flash memory that's sitting there, it's going to only be writing to that one spot over and over and over again. And that will destroy it. If you actually put fat on a solid state drive, it'll die in about 18 days. So if you want to make it last longer, what you do is you come up with an algorithm that says, you wrote there last time, so now I'm going to separate you from the flash. And I'm going to make a table that says every time you ask for sector 525, sector 525 is actually over here. Next time I'm going to move it and you say 525, it may be over here. So they have something called PBA to LBA conversion table. So they can actually do a physical block address and change it from one to the other. So wear leveling content is basically going to be saving the device by moving the data from one location to another. So if this was a Word file and a PDF and it swapped the two, you don't make changes to your PDF very often. So that's kind of the premise of wear leveling. Now, it's gotten worse as we've discussed over time, but in a hard drive, when you make a change, not that this really happens, but it can happen, I can use a hex editor, I can open up one location on the hard drive, and I can edit that location over and over and over again. So I could say, every time I touch sector 525 and I modify 525, I write it back. I write it back to the same place. So I can keep writing to the same location all the time. But you cannot do that in a solid state disk. In a solid state disk, I go to modify a file, I read the content, I modify it, but the content's still there. I can't recharge that area, although that's what some software vendors are trying to do. I will normally take that content and then store it someplace else and abandon the original content, put it in a garbage collection routine, or do trim and immediately delete it. Do you guys understand what I'm saying now? Now, as you heard earlier in the week, there's a description about how you have to delete content. If the content is in the same block, you cannot erase the content that's there. So the garbage collection routine cannot run unless everything else is free in the block. So imagine this. You and your wife and your kids and your cousin and whoever else is living in your house are living in a house, and you move. And so you pick up and you all move to a bigger house someplace else. You're probably not going to live on the same block. You're going to move somewhere else far away. And when you leave the house, no one else can move into your house until everyone else in your block moves and the cleaning crew comes in and cleans everything. So that means your neighbor's got to move and his neighbor's got to move, and probably also when your neighbor moves, he's not going to live next door to you at your new location. So you cause fragmentation to happen. When he moves, he's going to move to another block. So he's in a different location. So you're not contiguous anymore. You're not next to each other. So these houses all have to be empty before and cleaned before anyone else can move in. So that would be like every day, the hotel, everybody has to leave at 3 o'clock. And at 4 o'clock, everybody can move back in after the entire hotel is clean. But every day you got to take all your stuff with you. Like that's the premise. So you got to move everything else around before you can move anything back. So that's what's actually happening in a solid state disk. It actually has to be purged. And so there is processes going on saying, where should I write this? Where should I write this? Let's try to clean this up because I've got to erase this sector. In order to erase this sector, I have to erase the entire block. So this is just kind of some quick math that's basically, so I'm starting out by calling it a cell, but it's really a gate. And then as you move into collections of gates, then you end up having bytes, and then you still have your word lines. Then things are broken up into word lines and into sectors. Our smallest writable unit is a sector. So in other words, anytime I want to write something, I'm not writing, so like 512, if I'm on a hard drive and I'm writing 512, that is my smallest unit. So if I want to write, 1 byte, I have to write 512. Everybody understand this? If I want to modify that, I've got to read 512, modify it, write 512 back on all devices, right? Now if I'm going to do that on solid state, I've got my smallest writable unit, which is a sector. And a sector could be 2K or 4K or 8K. Yep.
But on a hard drive, you can't have a 4K sector now on a physical hard drive. And then are you writing?
We have a 4K sector. There are 4K sectors, and when you write, you are still writing 4K. Right, but the device, if so, on newer hard drives at 4K, that's really what they're doing. When we write down, we have one sector and it's 4K. We think we're writing 512 bytes. It's really writing 4K, and so it tries to align that so that it could do it in one write. But if it can't, it'll write the part that you need. Later on, when you write more, it'll read what you need and then write it back again. So it's actually writing the whole sector every time. You're not just writing part of a sector. You can't write part of a sector. Whatever you call sector, that's what has to change on all devices. Everybody understand? So 2K, 4K, 8K, whatever it is. So if you write one small file, it's got to change it. So now we're relying on the intellect of the device to actually figure out where we can write data and how we can write data and charge that, because if we waste space, it's going to take more write cycles in order for that to happen. And that's where the algorithm starts to come into what's called write amplification. Sometimes every time I write, I'm not writing enough data, so I end up having to write it twice. So I end up writing 2 sectors, or I write in one location too many times. So I've amplified how many times I've written to that location, and it's not a 1-to-1 correlation. It's normally a higher, 2-to-1, 3-to-1. And that's why they also start using compression, so that they don't go over into the other sectors. So you actually have sectors that are compressed now. And then if you want to erase it, you're only erasing a block. So now you've got a multiplier. So originally we had 512 bytes with 16 bytes for a flag, because there's 4 for ECC, then there's something else. So they had flags. So you had, over here in 2K, you have 64 bits that are actually reserved. So you actually have 2K and then 64 bytes that are reserved. So in that particular process, when we get to 4K, 8K, you multiply by whatever the chip was that was purchased. And it's usually 16, 32, or 64. And most of them are 64. So 2K times 64 is how big your sector is. So how big your block is. So yeah, so 128 in the block. So then you end up in a situation where this is the breakdown. This is what your hard drive would have been, and now there's also 4K. And then you have your flash drives over here. And here's the one that's the killer. So your smallest write size is 512. If it's 2K, then it's the 2K sector. If your smallest erasable one is a block, then that's a multiplier of how big that is to that. And if any of the sector is bad, if it is bad at all, then every sector, every item in the entire block is marked bad. So you lose 128K at a time, or 256K at a time. Those that go bad, you're losing huge amounts of space really fast. And this is why when they die, they're dying a sudden death. They're just a horrible, terrible death.
And it's cascading.
And what?
It's got less spaces to write, so it starts writing.
Yes.
off in the same
Well,
spot.
so what they do obviously is they add more sectors that you can, so you can have spare sectors. So you have, over provisioning is what that's called.
Josh was talking about.
Yes.
You know, right outside
Right.
the,
And every device has that. Every device has over-provisioned sectors. But what has happened is they've gotten way bigger than they used to be. It used to only be a percentage because they didn't expect them to go bad because they were using SLC. They were going to last a long time. As you move into MLC and triple bit, now you've got to increase that amount of space because more are going to go bad quicker. And you cannot have the size of your hard drive diminish. It cannot go down in size. So if blocks go bad, you just have to remove them from active service. So they're almost doubling some of the space on some of the drives I've seen. On some of the drives, instead of a 32 gig drive, you're getting 64 gigs or something along those lines. They're almost double. And it only uses 32 and uses the rest for wear leveling.
What's
Yep.
a regular platter? Like the read writes on a regular, regular hard drive. What is that? Like you're saying here, the amount of writes like 3,000 on a regular platter.
Well, so they do that by a mathematical equation, mean time to failure. So they do that based upon what they think the premise is of how long magnetism is going to last. And they normally estimate it to be between 3 and 5 years. They don't normally estimate it to be a certain number of specific writes, but they do. Their estimates are always really wrong. But as a whole, I mean, it'd be millions of writes at the bare minimum.
It seems a lot.
Magnetism is way more, this is way more robust than what they have in cells. By far. Hard drive is far more reliable long term with magnetism than with solid state in their cells. So now a lot of vendors will start claiming, oh yeah, our drives will last 51 years, or we figured out a way to write 1 million times to a cell. There really has not been that massive a change ever. There may be somebody making something that figured something else out, but fundamentally we're still living in the same world. When we have something that's like rock solid, hey, this thing's going to last forever, we will know it. It won't be these kind of problems that we're actually having. You won't have solid state drives that are just going bad. So we're not at that precipice yet.
How much of provisioning is done typically?
In what I'm seeing them move to 50%, but they have typically been a smaller percentage. In the normal over-provisioning, and this is from an engineer. I asked him if I could use this in my class, and he said yes. So he gave me, so this right here, this is your spares. So normally the quantity based on the size is based on how many bytes that you were going to increase it. So for the number of bits that you would actually have had for 512 bytes versus what you actually have in bits here, they were only increasing it in small percentages. So this was what they were doing over the short term. I do not agree with this anymore. There's nothing that's even close to those sizes, in my opinion, from what I've seen. I mean, it seems to be easier for them to just add in another chip, and it'll be way more, 4 gigs of space for a 16 gig chip or something like that. So typically it's done based upon the size of the chips that's available. So if you're going to put a thumb drive together and you want over provisioning done, and you can only get 16 gig chips, and you want more over provisioning, then you're selling that as a smaller one. You're selling that as an 8 gig with over provisioning. This is not usually 50% on a thumb drive because a thumb drive's not alive all the time. Thumb drives last longer than your normal solid state drives because they don't have power applied to them all the time. You're only using them for the couple of seconds you have it plugged in, and then you put it in your pocket. So it's off most of the time. So is your phone and your iPad. That's why they go to sleep. When they're asleep, they're not. There's some little garbage collection stuff that happens, but generally speaking, most of the time, they're doing less work during those off hours, and your laptop being off and things like that. It's really when you're talking about something like a solid state drive where it might be on all the time that you really are going to need some over provisioning. So that's why they're putting more and more in the hard drives, in the solid state hard drives, because of that, because they're going to die sooner. And they know that. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's what we're looking at as far as the size goes. And then we actually have, so we have write endurance, which I already talked about, how many times you can actually write. The number's lower than this. It turns out it's about 3,000. So these were estimates. And then retention. They say if you write data to your thumb drive and you put it on the shelf, it's going to be there for 10 years. I can tell you as a fact, and we haven't had a lot of time to actually test this theory out because they haven't been around that long, I'm going to say once you get between 5 and 7 years, you start having problems. So now this is a non-refreshed. So you put it on the shelf and you haven't used it. So you write a thumb drive, you put it on the shelf, and you don't plug it again. When you plug it again in 5 or 10 years, it'll be blank. So Planet of the Apes is not going to be working. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Later on, when society crashes, your computer that's 25 years, 30 years from now that had flash or had NAND as its storage device is going to be blank. It's not going to run. It'll be empty. The electrons dissipate from the cells.
What happens if, say, once a year you plug it in, run it for an hour?
Yeah, if you refresh, if it refreshes all the sectors and goes through that process, then it's rewriting that process and starts over. So if you're a police officer who has cases that you wrote on a SD card and you put them in a safe, in 10 years, they're going to be blank. So if you have a case in 7 years, you may need to put a schedule on there that says every 5 years I refresh my stuff. So photographers do this. This is one of the problems with photographers. They've been using memory in cameras for longer than we've been using memory for anything else. And they're the only ones who are going back to this. So they took pictures for a wedding 20 years ago, and for some reason somebody wants something, and they try to go back to that, one of those first, it wasn't SD cards back then, but one of those first memory sticks. They dissipate, and then you can no longer get access to them. So they're like, you can still pull a floppy disk out of a closet that's 20 years old, and it will still currently read data. Mostly. Not always. And your CDRs. Your CDRs don't last because your CDRs are made from organic material. CDRs are made with a dye. Most of them are made with a dye, especially the older ones. They first started doing a dye from a plant, and you would burn a hole through the dye, and the reflective layer would then reflect down through the hole. So those will die over time. The organic material deteriorates. So CDRs that are 20 years old stop working.
What about just a regular CD like music?
No, those are pressed. So those are aluminum, and they're pressed with a actual press. So those will typically live on almost indefinitely, as long as you don't bend them, do anything to them, or damage them in other ways. Those are not subject, like for instance, ultraviolet light will hurt a CDR. It will not hurt an aluminum disc. So over time, your music doesn't play on the others, but now your on your aluminum disc will be fine. So, but who has those? How many of those can we do? There's not even hardly any aluminum pressing plants anymore. There's like 2 plants that still make CD-ROMs. All right. So anyway, this is kind of the breakdown of the data. There are additional. And there doesn't have to be 16. There can be way more than 16. But normally for 512 bytes or 2K or whatever, you've actually got 4 bytes of ECC that will still be there per one of those items. Or more. Some of them will have more ECC because they're expecting error correcting code to be necessary for some of these as they start to die. So they're increasing that space so they can have more data that recoups in case of damage. So that's also another one of those tricks that they're actually using that would be kind of smoke and mirrors. So here's kind of the thing. The difference between a SSD and a thumb drive is power to the processor and the processor running all the time. When you have power on the processor on the flash drive itself, on the SSD, it's doing everything. It's managing content. But on a thumb drive, it needs a driver. So physically itself, when you're actually looking at a thumb drive, you're looking at a controller chip, you've got memory, it still needs your processor to move stuff around. It's using your processor in most cases. Power is applied to it. Now some of them have their own controllers now that all they need is power, and they'll start moving stuff around. But generally speaking, they are requiring a driver. The biggest company out there was SanDisk. SanDisk bought Memory Systems, and they made tools for doing flash drives and the whole thing, and now they're owned by Western Digital. In this process, you'll actually see that the first part of this is the driver layer. It's an OS-dependent driver layer, and that does your wear level managing. All the stuff has to happen somewhere in software, firmware, and a quantity of other things along the way. But at this point in time, it does require and has most of the time uses your CPU for processing power and for doing certain things.
Would that mean that performance can be different across different operating systems?
Yes, and it is different across different operating systems. So if you go to a Linux operating system and they use a completely different driver, usually it's some variation of JFFS, so they use variations on those drivers. It is different speeds under different OSs. So most of the time, and drivers have become fairly standard across the board that most of the vendors, like Microsoft has like culled most of them, Apple has culled most of the vendors, they all use very similar code. But JFFS, all the stuff in Linux has to be written. So a lot of people have written drivers that use these standard calls. But a solid state disk is responsible inside of its own device for all emulation. It has to